Welcome everybody that's already on today's webinar. We're going to give people a few more minutes to log on before we get started. Thank you for your patience. Hello everyone, good morning. Thank you for joining us on our third Sage Intacct webinar of the year. Latest updates in the Sage Intacct 2019 Release 3. I'm Tracy Shaver and I'll be your moderator today. Before we jump in, I'm going to briefly go over how to use the webinar console. The orange arrow on the right will let you toggle the control tray open or closed. At the bottom of the control tray, you'll see the chat window. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar for our presenters via the chat function. We will have a Q&A after the webinar, but if we don't get them today, we'll make sure to respond to your questions after the webinar. On your GoToWebinar console, you should see an area for audio settings. If you're calling in through the telephone, please choose the Use Telephone option. And if you're using your computer speakers, please select the Use Mic and Speakers option. Additionally, I'd like to note this webinar is being recorded. We will also send out the slides as well as a link to an on-demand recording of this webinar within 48 hours. Please keep an eye out for this email if you're interested in viewing the webinar after today or sharing it with any of your colleagues who couldn't make it. We are offering CPE today with today's presentation. To qualify for CPE, you must use a personal computer, no smartphones, and log in with your own information and unique URL. Be logged into our online software for at least 50 consecutive minutes within the scheduled time frame of the webinar. Actively respond to at least 75% of our polling questions. Complete the evaluation survey at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Brenda and David. Brenda's a senior manager consulting with Armanino, and David's a consultant in consulting Armanino's department. And with that, I'd like to jump it over to Brenda for the learning objectives and agenda.
Excellent. Can you hear me?
We can.
Awesome. So, good morning. Today's learning objectives are to experience the new features available in the Action UI and learn how to leverage them. Examine ways to further automate bank reconciliations with bank feeds. Evaluate our workflow improvements to limit contact records and drop-down lists, and also disable top-level subledger transactions to improve the user experience. And we will also investigate improved reporting options for summary-style presentations of general ledger balances with dimension values, as well as a host of other new reports and graphs. So our agenda for today is to go through these modules: the user experience, general ledger, budget and planning, cash management, projects, contracts, inventory, the Salesforce integration, reporting and dashboards, platform and web services, global consolidations, workflow, and more. Whew, so that's quite a bit. So let's go ahead and dive in. Take it away, David.
All right, good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with you talking about this latest release, and let's just jump into it and get started with changes in user experience. So as many may now know and might have noticed, Action UI became the default user interface in this release. So what's going to happen in this and future releases is that new features and enhancements are going to be rolled out into the Action UI. If you ever need to switch back to the previous UI for any reason, you're going to be prompted with a dialog box asking you why. And this screenshot on the right side of your screen is kind of going to be what you're going to see when you switch to the UI. This is basically here to help Intacct understand and hopefully resolve whatever your issue is with the UI, and it's going to make Action UI a lot stronger in future releases. To switch to the previous UI, you're just going to hit your name up at the top right corner of any screen, and it's going to take you to your user preference or that little drop-down menu right there, and you're just going to hit switch to previous UI. Just as a quick note for this, switching to Action is an
Sorry.
No worries. Switching to Action is an individual option, so no others are going to be impacted by your own changing of UI. And if at any time you ever want to switch back to Action UI from the previous UI, you're just going to click that large blue button that's labeled Switch to Action UI that's at the top of any page. So next, let's talk about some Action UI enhancements. So in addition to a bunch of new functional changes in Intacct, there's also going to be a whole host of visual enhancements that are really intended to help users navigate the system a lot more smoothly. So you're now going to have the option to click or hover when navigating in menus. This function can be set in your user preferences as shown in the screenshot. And it's gonna, where you can opt to click or hover as you navigate in any menu in Intacct. The entity picker is gonna allow for type ahead access if you have 10 plus entities. And depending on your permissions, you'll be able to set unique colors for your company, console, and entities. So with this, admins can set the colors that are viewed by everyone in the system, but users can also set their own individual unique color preferences that can override any admin set color. And finally, in Action UI enhancements, there is now enhanced visibility and fine tuning for easier viewing and scanning of pages. So there's three main things that happened here. Color banding has been added to distinguish rows in lists and grids. Text size and density has been increased for readability in menus and pages. And color contrast has been intensified to pop relevant information. So all these things, these new enhancements are really going to increase, like it said, your visibility and really increase your efficiency with how you're going to be able to navigate and use the system. And finally, in user experience, let's talk about some pages that were converted to Action UI. So in both the order entry and purchasing modules, the recurring transaction page has been reformatted into 3 different tabs. These 3 tabs are the transaction tab, the payment tab, and the schedule tab. So first off, the transaction tab has replaced the header and line item tabs that were in the previous UI. The fields that were on these 2 tabs are now all in the transactions tab and have been moved and grouped into logical sections. For the most part, this page is really going to look identical to an order entry or purchasing transaction page. Next, we have the payment tab. So on this tab, if you remember the customer and payment terms fields that were in the previous UI, these were read-only. They have been removed on this tab. And finally, in the schedule tab, like the payment tab, the customer and payment term fields were removed, and also labels and fields were changed to make setting the schedule much easier. So the following chart on the screen kind of lists the changes that were made to this tab specifically, the schedule tab. And this can kind of be reviewed later when the slide deck gets sent out.
Those all sound like great improvements for user ease of use, really, for the user.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the biggest thing going on with the new user experience in the Action UI is really going to increase efficiency and really thinking about the overall user experience.
Awesome. Well, that leads us.
Cool. Now we're on to our first polling question. So just as a reminder, if you are looking for CPE, we do need you to answer at least 75% of the polling questions. So we'll get into polling question number 1 here in just a second.
We've got it up.
Oh, thank you. All right. So have you started using the new Action interface? Yes, no, or not sure? It should be a simple one. I'll just give the audience a few more seconds here.
One reason. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Brenda.
I was going to say one of the reasons why you might not be sure is if you were implemented anytime in the last 2 years, we never showed you the old interface. Action has been available as the default interface since fall of 2017. So for those of you that it's new to you, you probably were implemented either recently or you just never realized that you were already in Action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we got 10% not sure, 18% no, and 72% yes.
Excellent.
So, yeah. So we'll pass it back to David for our next section.
Well, just one more comment about the users that have not started using it yet. So the current interface that you are using is going to go away early next year, and you'll be forced into the prior user interface. If you're in the prior user interface now, you'll be forced into action in next year's release. And so something to think about is user adoption is going to be easier if you have the ability to switch back and forth between the two now. If you haven't started using it, you're going to be forced into it probably at a time when you're in the middle of something important and be forced to change it. So.
Yeah, that's a great point, Brenda.
Back to you, David.
All right. Yeah, so now let's talk about some changes that were made in the general ledger module. So first off, let's talk about some more functionality for dynamic account allocations. So you're now able to allocate asset and liability account activity for things such as accruals, as long as that account does not disallow direct posting. So allocating asset and liability activity is going to allow you to allocate activity that's temporarily on your balance sheet. And this is really going to allow you to get better insight into the true picture of your financial position. A couple other things to note here is that allocation definitions, allocation groups, and group member info can now be imported via a template. So a lot of you might be familiar with the company import data screen, the company setup checklist. You're now going to be able to find an option to import allocations here under this list simply by clicking the template. After it's filled out, go ahead and import it, and you'll now be able to mass update those allocations, allocation definitions, groups, and group member info. And finally, kind of around dynamic account allocations, allocation definitions, allocation groups, allocation group members, and allocation logs can now be used as primary data sources when creating custom reports. So next on the general ledger, something that I'm really excited about is the general ledger standard report. So this is a new report that is going to provide a summary style presentation of balances with dimension values. You're going to be able to find this report in the reports center labeled as the dimension balances report. You'll also be able to find it on the general ledger menu screen, again labeled as the dimension balances report. What this report is really going to allow for you to do is to aggregate your dimensions rather than filter by one at a time. So what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to select dimensions to include in this balance style report along with the presentation format so that dimensions can appear side by side as columns or cascading. In addition, you'll be able to select the dimension name and dimension ID individually or select a combined dimension ID and name presentation. So this screenshot right here at the bottom of the screen is going to show you a sample dimension balance report with opening balance, period balance, and closing balance for travel expenses by department and account in the cascading format. So this is a report that I'm really excited to start using and start seeing, and I think it's going to really be helpful to just display a lot of your dimensions overall, like it said, rather than having to go through and filter one by one. And finally, in the general ledger, let's just go over more control over exchange rates. So in this release, you're now able to set an alternative default rate from Awanda 24 hours prior. So this is going to be really useful for companies that have transactions that take place in UTC +6 through +14 and UTC -9 through -12 time zones. Just as a note, this exchange rate applies to all users and it's going to be permanent as soon as you set it. To go ahead and set up the exchange rate you want to use in the general ledger, you're going to want to go to General Ledger, Setup, Configuration, scroll down to the Multi-Currency Management header, and select one of the following options from the Intacct rate option, as you can see on the screenshot, the current rate or the 1 day prior. This new rate is going to be really helpful because in certain locations, using the current exchange rate is going to run the risk of recording half a day's transaction using the next day's exchange rate in the middle of the workday. So it's definitely something to consider if you're in those time zones. It might be a really useful thing for you to use in how you do and how you configure exchange rates in the general ledger. And now I'm going to pass it off to Brenda, who's going to talk about budget and plans.
And Brenda, just before you start, I just have a quick comment. If anyone online has any application shut down, just try to relog in again. We may be experiencing some technical difficulties. So just, if anything happens, just try to relog in. Brenda?
That sounds great. So the only other comment I wanted to make on those exchange rates is if you're in a global consolidations environment, like David mentioned, it would be, one of the things you have to consider is, that it's 12-hour time difference, to go to like most of Asia, kind of the Australia, New Zealand kind of area. So this was something that I struggled with when I was a global controller, that they were using a different exchange rate on the same actual day of posting, but because their days were different than our days, there was always a little bit of a lag. So hopefully this enhancement David was discussing is going to solve that problem for those of you that are international. So I know that was something I struggled with. All right, so on to budget and planning. So budget and planning is Intacct's latest model, and this allows you with a separate login to log into the system and do some planning and budgeting with your actual data. So there's been a bunch of new functionality that has been added. So one of the great improvements here is you can easily match your budget process. So before you had to kind of create the budget at the start by picking which dimensions you wanted to include. And now it's kind of drag and drop. It's a little like building a pivot table. So really user-friendly, really easy to think about. Are you budgeting first by location and then by department? Or are you budgeting first by project and then by location? Or what that kind of order of operations is and what the most important dimensions are for you in your organization. The other new feature with this release is you can now populate your budget with actuals. So if you're creating a new budget, you can say, I want to take last year's actuals as a starting point for my budget, or you can take last year's budget and use that as a starting point for this year's budget. So it essentially is allowing you to duplicate and modify similar to how it works within the Intacct system proper as well. So a nice feature not to have to populate that manually or go through an upload process. There's now just a button that you can hit there. You can also preview your budget versus past data. So I can look at current year data budget versus last year actuals to get a good baseline there. So the preview function is really helpful. And now I can also create a budget for multiple entities or for a single entity. Before, when you were in a multi-entity shared environment, you could only create a budget for the entire organization as a whole. So if you wanted to create a single entity budget, you were not able to do so. So with this release, you are now able to do so. These are the highlights of the budget updates. In our webinar last month, or last quarter rather, for release 2, we did a poll and kind of asked if anybody is really using this module yet. And it seemed like the majority of our client base was not using it. So we opted not to include a ton of slides in this slide deck here to cover every little update that was done like we do for everything else. But if there is something, if you are using this module and more updates would be helpful, please, at the questionnaire closeout at the end of this, please let us know that you're using this module and you would like some more updates. And as this module starts getting more and more people on it, we are definitely seeing an uptick in those statements of work. We'll probably start spending a little bit more time on this module in the future. All right, back to you, David, for some cash updates.
Perfect. Yeah, let's jump into it. So let's talk about bank feeds. So I think just to start as a note, this functionality is going to be expected to be available in late October. It's not in the system yet, and it's going to require a subscription to the banking and payment cloud. So basically what bank feeds is really going to allow you to do is going to enable connection to thousands of banks with really just a simple push of a button in the UI. It's going to create payments directly from transactions for customer invoices with no manual data entry required.
Amazing.
You're now going to be able to automatically match customer payments to invoices, and any unmatched deposits will automatically flow to the bank transactions page. And finally, with the new bank feed, transactions will flow into the reconciliation and be auto matched. And this is going to be huge because it's going to greatly reduce your workload and eliminate a lot of time-consuming manual manipulation of import files. So I think I can speak for myself and for you, Brenda, that this is probably one of the coolest features that's being rolled out. I know personally I'm really excited to get to work with the bank feeds.
Oh my goodness, so excited. And I can practically hear the cheers from our folks on the webinar as well. This has long been a big sticking point for Intacct, that QuickBooks could do this and they could not. And it was really frustrating, especially for us, to have to tell clients, yes, oh God, I hate to say it, but QuickBooks is better at this. So at long last, and this is really a direct result of the merger with Sage. And so we're really starting, we hoped that it was going to really allow them to accelerate the development and to bring more features to market faster. And we've seen that be true, both in the consolidations area as well as in this banking area. So this bank feed, it's actually over 10,000 banks, I believe they said they had. There's also a way to request a bank be added if your bank is not listed. But even like here in the Bay Area, we noticed like a little credit union was still in there. And this is because this is leveraging the Sage's banking platform that's been long established. And so they got Intacct able to use that, which is why it has so many connections already. So it's highly likely that you will find your bank there. That all being said, everybody wants this. And so while it did come out with release 3, it's being rolled out in phases to clients. So if you don't see bank feeds available in your system yet, you will soon. They are anticipating to have it rolled out to all clients prior to Advantage. And so you will get a notification when you are able to set up those bank feeds there. And then you can enroll your bank. It is free. So you can enroll up to 200 bank accounts for free. If you have more than 200 bank accounts, should be a pretty rare case for our clients. But if you do, then we can put you in touch with your account manager to be able to get more than 200 banks set up. So very excited for this and really looking forward to it. So if you don't see it yet, sit tight. It is coming, and it'll definitely be here before release 4 is out.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for more information on that. That's great. All right, next, let's move on to the bank reconciliation enhancements. So now you're going to be able to perform soft reconciliations whenever you pull banking info from the cloud, which is, again, going to greatly reduce your recon efforts. So that's kind of tying back to what we were talking about with bank feeds. You're now, when you pull your bank transactions into the system, you'll now be able to define which attributes you want to use to match checks and deposits. And column headers can now be used to sort reconciliation. So that's a new function. And kind of the final point is instead of losing your work midway through a reconciliation, you can now make partial matches and come back later to finish the rest. So again, this is just going to help with your efficiency, not being able to have to sit down and completely finish it, kind of go through little by little, knock it out, and really be able to finish your reconciliations and a lot more efficiently. And finally, in cash management, let's talk about charge payoffs. So I think some people might know, but if you don't, funds transfer no longer supports credit cards. So we know that many were using this as a really common way to pay off credit card balances, but there's now a much better way to do it that's really going to minimize your errors during reconciliation, and that's going to be by using the charge payoff screen. So when you create a charge payoff, you also create an AP bill for your credit card charges, which can then be paid in the new pay bills screen. And this is going to be now the recommended functionality for this scenario. So if you need a little bit more information on this new functionality, there's a lot of documentation in both the Help Center in Intacct as well as the Intacct community to kind of walk you through this process if you've been doing it the old way and now you're getting errors and you need to move to the new way. So a lot of good stuff out there if you're experiencing errors. So now I'm going to toss it back to you, Brenda, for updates on projects.
Awesome. Thanks, David. So just a quick update on project, just one update this time. However, it's a really good one. So Intacct with this update has implemented what they're referring to as the standard task catalog. So this will really be helpful for any of you that are using the same tasks on multiple projects or on different types of projects. You have a standard set of tasks that they're using. So previously, we probably set you up with like a template project or a copy project that you could duplicate that had all the tasks assigned and allows you to really speed up that creation. So now instead of doing that when you're creating the project, instead of assigning tasks individually, you can also assign tasks from the standard task catalog instead of recreating the same tasks that you want on every single project, which of course would lead potentially to data entry, human error kind of thing. So using the standard task catalog will allow you to really set, especially if you're using timesheets and time types in the system, you've got your overtime and you've got your double time and you've got your straight time. In some cases, you might have 50% time. We've got that here at Armanino for some of our travel time, for example. So, since there is so much set on the task about whether it's billable, how the revenue recognition for that task is going to work, having the standard task catalog will really allow us to fine tune that. And this update is a result of the kind of cohabitation now of the projects and the contracts module working together, because the contracts needs this when filtering into projects, and so it makes sense for the projects module to have this by default. So that's a good improvement there, which leads me, of course, right into contracts. So one of the things I've noticed in the last couple of releases is that the contracts updates are slowing down a little. So it's been pretty contract heavy, I would say, for maybe the last 2 years or so, with the implementation of ASC 606 and Intacct and every other kind of SaaS-based company really needing that. There's been a lot of time and attention spent on the contracts module. And so the fact that it's slowing down means it's probably getting very close to its final state. And they'll be able to kind of switch development efforts into other areas, which we have been seeing, a lot of updates in the core product this year so far. So I expect that to continue through the next several releases. Okay, so contracts overall, this update allows you to automate the retrospective contract reporting balance. So anybody that has the contracts module knows how difficult and what a pain it was to import and walk forward all of your contracts to be able to have established beginning balances for your disclosures under 606. So it was really tedious, time-consuming, and required a lot of implementation time, which made implementation of the contracts module quite expensive as well. So the new process allows you to automate most of the manual tasks by posting the applicable all billing, revenue, and expense schedule entries within the contract subledger. And that effectively bypasses the GL. So you can then report on the subledger data, analyze it, review it, and when you're satisfied, make the beginning contract balance entries in the GL. So it allows you to kind of have that housed totally within the contracts module until you're ready to have it actually post. So hallelujah for that. Unfortunately, this is not going to help those of you that have already implemented the contracts module. However, it will help you if you're thinking about implementing it and looking forward to it, or if you are do an acquisition and you inherit contracts, so you want to move that new entity onto the contracts module. Implementation and addition of those new entities and those new contracts is going to be much easier than the initial implementation. So there is some good news there for you. And the diagram here that I've got up on the screen is just a diagram of what that kind of project would look like, and what's hitting the contract subledger. And we'll get into some new contracts reports as well a little bit later on. So this update here allows you to include contract lines with project or task percentage complete for multiple element arrangements. And so under 606, when you've got a multi-element arrangement where you've got multiple deliverables under the contract that perhaps have different delivery or different revenue recognition schedules, or most likely both. And so when you have these contract lines with a fixed fee project that is recognized based on project or task percentage complete, take heart. So previously you needed to manually calculate the MEA allocations that included these type of contract lines. So now you can include the project and task percentage complete on the contract lines with the MEA allocation scheme. So that way Sage Intacct will automatically allocate the total bundle contract value between the participating contract lines when that percentage complete is triggered. So as with the existing MEA allocation functionality, you can execute the MEA allocation process multiple times, with each allocation having its own specific effective date, so that balances posted prior to the effective date are not affected. And the system includes the net difference between the MEA allocations, including to the type of adjustment selected. So for example, if your MEA allocation scheme applied to a particular revenue journal, you do have to have the same adjustment type. So if you select one time as the adjustment type for the first MEA allocation applied to Journal 1, then all subsequent MEA allocations applied to Journal 1 require that adjustment type to be one time. So you can't flip-flop on adjustment types. So the other caveat for you to be aware of is after percent completed revenue is posted, you can't clear the first MEA allocation. So in this scenario, you'd clear the posted percent complete revenue and then clear the MEA allocation. But if the percent complete contract lines participate in a second MEA allocation, you won't be able to clear any of the MEA allocations. And then lastly, of course, all contract lines in the MEA must use the same currency in order to do this. But hopefully for those of you that do have fixed fee project revenue on contract lines that's recognized on either project or task percentage complete, this will make it a lot more easier to get to that rev rec stage. And our last contracts update for this release is they have added a boatload of new reports. So now that we're pretty far into the contracts module, they've heard from all of the clients and of course themselves, they're using Intacct for their own work. What do you need in terms of reporting? So they have released 3 new standard contracts package reports. So there's the contract forecast reports, the management reports, and the subledger reports. So the forecast reports have a bunch of different reports. It's all the same report, but it's grouped different ways, by contract, by item GL group, or by contract line. And it'll give you insight into revenue, billing, and expense. The management reports are really looking at line detail, renewals that are coming up or past due, and the schedule state for each line item. And then also a report on anything that's unbilled but recognized. So this would be you recognize the revenue for percentage completion, but you haven't yet sent that bill. So also important to make sure that you understand as management, and then a bunch of subledger reports as well. So with the new ability to walk it forward within the subledger only, of course, general ledger reports are no longer going to work. So they realized that they needed some more reports within the submodule to be able to allow you to view that walk forward process before you want to post it to your general ledger. All right, and with that, I think we are polling question 2.
All right, great. So polling question number 2. What aspects of the release do you feel will be most beneficial to your organization? A, bank feeds. B, dimensions balancing report. C, standard tax catalog. D, ability to limit contacts in drop-down lists. E, other. And if it's other, just go ahead and chat us in the chat box.
And I know we haven't talked about all of these things yet, but perhaps you have noticed some of these features, or maybe you've read through kind of the release notes yourself. Just remember that you do need to answer at least 75% of our polling questions in order to get your CPE credit. So this is question 2 of 4. So if you missed the first one, make sure you're getting this one.
Yep, and then for those who joined a little bit later, we will be sending out a recording of this webinar as well. So we'll just give a few more seconds here for the answers, and we can go ahead and share. And David and Brenda, if you want to comment on the results.
I think, yeah, people are sharing kind of the same sentiment, at least seeing with the bank feeds. I know that's the one I'm thinking will be most beneficial and I'm most excited about. So that's cool to see other people.
Yeah,
agree.
same. That's a thing. And everybody that answered the dimension balancing report, you're probably in the middle of your audit right now, because those are the kinds of things that auditors are asking for generally. Or you've got a lot of dimensions, and that interplay between those dimensions is real important. I really like that report. It's a report that we've created custom for clients for a long time now. So I'm really happy to see it be added as part of the core package.
Yeah, and if this 3%, if you want to chat and let us know, we can touch base after and see what you guys are most excited about. All right, and then we're going to pass it over to David for the next section.
Great. So let's move on to inventory. So I think a lot of people know, and some people might be using, if they're using the inventory module, the maintain inventory valuation feature was added several releases ago. And now in this update, to get best results when using this feature, it's going to be recommended that you're going to want to schedule nightly updates with these 3 options. So these 3 options are: 1, using an as of date that was either when you first started using Sage Intacct or the inventory control application. 2, updating the costs and inventories in the inventory subledger and the internal cost tables in both your open and closed periods. And 3rd, updating the GL with recalculated COGS in your open periods. So after you select the new automatically run updates nightly checkbox in your inventory configuration, you're going to see a lot greater efficiency when using this maintain inventory valuation tool. I think what's important to note here is that this tool can still be used on an as needed basis. You don't need to check this checkbox, and you don't need to run it with those options. But it's kind of recommended that you do, because you're going to see a lot greater efficiency you're going to get these same results that you would do on using the tool on an as-needed basis with a lot less time and a lot less effort. So we're really, really recommending that. Next, let's talk about the summary level physical inventory report. So we all know that this report used to be able to run by detail. Now with this new release, you're going to be able to run a summary report where items are grouped by warehouse, and they're going to hide these following columns: your document ID, serial number, lot number, aisle, row, bin, expiration date. So this is going to be a really ideal report for you if you're not using serial or lot numbering in your warehouses and you just need a quick overview of what's on hand. It's a great option to just, again, get a really quick overview, quick data, and kind of move on from there. So that's kind of it for inventory. Let's move on to the advanced CRM integration for Salesforce. So in the Salesforce Integration Enhancements, this is kind of a selective upgrade here. It's basically going to be new functionality for the integration that uses both, for companies and people that use both the Intacct digital board book as well as Salesforce CPQ, configure, price, and quote. So if you have both of these enabled, basically what this functionality is going to do is when contract lines are set to renew in Salesforce, this CRM integration attempts to match any new opportunity products items with items that already exist on your original contract. So basically what this is going to do also is that duplicate items are not going to be allowed to be copied from the original contract to the renewal contract, which is going to, again, just limit how much you have to do on your own end with cleanup of some duplicates that might flow through. So yeah, it's going to be a good functionality upgrade for you if you have both the digital board book as well as Salesforce CPQ.
Definitely.
All right, and now we're on to polling question number 3. What tool do you use to track revenue? A, Sage Intacct, B, Salesforce, C, Razor's Edge, and D, other? Please let us know in the comments.
So similar to what we did with the budget and planning, they've been doing a lot of updates on their Salesforce standard connector. So we're just kind of curious what all of our clients are using to house that front end revenue system. So there's a lot of them out there. Obviously, you hear about Salesforce a lot these days. Some of our nonprofit clients will be familiar with Razor's Edge, very common for recording kind of donor contributions. It's a Blackbaud product. And of course, there's probably 200 other questions we could name as well.
So there's the results.
And we see one of the others that came in was Microsoft Dynamics CRM and Campus Nexus.
All right. Thanks for that. It's always helpful to know.
Awesome. And Brenda, you're up next.
Awesome. Just trying to, does it take a minute to give me control back? There we go. All right, so platform and web services. So there is one new permission that was given to administrators under the admin section of permissions to allow the installation of custom applications with user-defined dimensions. So if you're not familiar with platform services, or you're familiar with it only to the extent that you know that that's where you build your custom invoices and reports and write your smart rules and events, that's what most clients are using platform for. But it's a really powerful tool that you can use to build out any custom applications or integrations to other systems, to really customize the functionality within the system to meet your needs. So because user-defined dimensions are so special, they wanted to make sure that not all admins necessarily could authorize an installation of an application with a user-defined dimension, because they might not fully understand all of the implications that that might have. And so now that is a specifically user permission. And so right now, none of your users have this permission because Intacct will not automatically grant permissions. So if this is something that you need in the future to be able to create those applications with user-defined dimensions, you will need to first find that permission under administration and give it to one or more of your admins. Note that at the bottom here, admins cannot grant this permission to themselves. So if you are in a system where you have only one admin, either Intacct or us should be able to also give you those permissions if you do need them. But generally, if you're going to be building applications and need this, it will be our recommendation that you have 2 or more admins so that you can grant permissions to each other as needed. So just a quick update on that. For web services, I just put a couple of the updates in web services. Generally, what we see as web services updates is that these are updates to the API calls that you're able to make in the system, either by using a custom application or by using the third-party marketplace apps that are available there. And normally, all of these updates are going to follow the updates that are made in the user interface. So they make the same new things available. And so if you want to see all of the updates that are made, if you do have a developer license, you're doing custom allocations, or you're doing API calls within your own system, developer.intacct.com/blog will get you there. And then you can see all of the updates that they do make. They do make updates to the API and the web services calls slightly more frequently than quarterly. And so you can always see the, 3.1, 3.2 kind of updates that they might do in the interim as well at that blog site. And then also we have an update for global consolidations. So this is going to be really helpful for those of you that are using lots of dimensions in your system, but don't need lots of dimensions in your consolidation, because on a consolidated basis, you're not reporting out at the vendor level or at the customer level, but you might need to report out at the department or project level, or maybe even class. And so prior consolidations within the system, anything that you have done included all dimensions. So if you have a lot of entities, a lot of dimensions, consolidation can take a long time, sometimes up to, I think the longest I had mine take with 26 entities and related currencies and all the dimensions was just over an hour. Between when it finished consolidating and when it would let me know that it was done. And that's just for 1 month of data. If you think about consolidations from an implementation standpoint, we've got to consolidate all the way back to the first period you have history in the system. And so if you don't need these dimensions on your consolidation going forward, you can go and now update your consolidation book, or when you're setting up new consolidations, you can uncheck the dimensions that you might not need. All right, reporting updates, David.
Yep. All right, so in the last release, there were 2 new out-of-the-box dashboards that were added to the general quick start template if you are using the general quick start template. But in this release, Sage Intacct has released several new financial reports and graphs, again, to the general quick start template. Some of these new financial reports are the profit and loss detail for vendor, profit and loss detail for customer, profit and loss detail for employee, profit and loss detail for item, profit and loss detail for project, and revenue by customers. While some of the new graphs that were added were the budget versus actual for project, operating expense by project, operating expense by employee, operating expense by vendor, project profitability, revenue by class, revenue by customer, and revenue by item. So really, these new reports that are added, they're going to save you a lot of time when creating, reports and graphs that can be used on your dashboard. So I think this was a really great add to the general quick start template if you're using it. That's going to help you save a lot of time over the long run if you want to ever use any of these reports or graphs. Next in reporting and insights, let's talk about interactive custom report writer enhancements. So there's been various improvements to the custom report writer that are now going to allow for a lot greater insight when using these kind of reports. So there's been new runtime prompts that have been added for dimension groups and start and end date, which is going to allow you to get a lot more granular results when filtering these custom reports. And there's also a lot, there's more responsive dashboard dimension filters. So when you create a custom report that's added to a dashboard, you can now set the component to allow certain filters to be applied to that dashboard, or certain filters that are applied to that dashboard to also be applied to the custom report. So when you're creating or editing your dashboard or your report as a dashboard component, you're going to want to set the live view to enable dashboard filter to be applied. And just as a quick note on all of this, the dashboard as of date currently has no effect on custom reports. So if you choose the setting to allow the filter to be applied, that one, if it doesn't change, that one's obviously not going to change. And then finally, in reporting and insights, let's talk about the reclassification reason. So in staff expense reports, you can reclassify employee expenses or expense adjustments that have a selected or paid state. So now when you click on that reclassify button to either reclassify the expense or the adjustment, you're going to see a new field on the screen, kind of where that arrow is pointing right there, the reclassification reason. This is going to require you to put a description of what you changed on this expense or adjustment and why, and it's going to store it in the expense report history. So in the future, if you ever need to know why this expense was reclassified, you can find it by clicking the paid link under state, and it's going to give you the exact reason, the reclassification reason for reporting purposes and to seeing for future reference.
Hallelujah. This makes my little auditor heart pitter patter.
Yeah, that's going to be a really great. Yeah.
Now, hopefully this means that they'll be rolling this out to every other sub-module that you can reclassify things in, because I would definitely love to see this in accounts payable as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would be the logical next step. So yeah, now I'm going to pass it back off to Brenda, and I think she's going to talk about workflow and more.
All right, final section, and then we'll have one last polling question for you. All right, so in workflow and more, this is kind of like all the user enhancements that either cross modules or we only had kind of one quick update and didn't want to create a whole section for something in some cases. So in this case, it's the ability to limit contacts and drop down lists. So in my opinion, this is functionality that everybody already thought existed in the system and that now they have actually created it. And so when you're creating a customer or vendor record, you have the option on the contacts tab to add additional contacts. You can have a ship to, a bill to, a return to, and a 1099 contact. Depending on whether you're a vendor or customer, some or all of those might not be available. And you can set those contacts. However, when you get to the actual screen to enter in a bill or an invoice, every contact in the system was available in the bill to, ship to, pay to kind of contact fields there. And so checking this box now on your configurations will limit the ability, so you will no longer see every possible contact in the system. You'll see only those contacts related to the customer or vendor. So this does two things. So one, if you have limited customer and vendor visibility to particular entities and therefore to particular people, most likely as well, they were able to see all contacts in the system. So while you could limit the customer and vendor records, you couldn't limit visibility of the contact record. There's actually no permissions related to contacts. You get them along with permissions to customers and vendors. So now this really kind of closes that loophole where they could see contacts, but not customer or vendor records. So a real nice enhancement here in my mind. The other one, disable top level sub-ledger transactions. If you were implemented by us anytime in, let's say, maybe the last 3 or 4 years, we probably implemented a package similar to this because we recognize the need to not have the things that were done in your sub-module in multiple places throughout the system, necessitating you to either do 2 check runs or 2 invoice runs in order to get everything out. Of course, if you're in an intercompany arrangement, inter-entity, multi-entity environment with multiple entities, you may need to do top-level sub-ledger transactions if you have bills that were, incurred for one entity but paid for by the other. However, for those of you in single entity environment or single entity, multi-entity environments, you don't want anybody to post anything at the top level. So this will allow you to disable it altogether. Note that you can't disable it in some modules, but not others. If you need it enabled in some places, but not others, call us, call your account client manager here at Armanino, and we can get you set up with our package that allows the flexibility to say yes for AP, no for AR, and that kind of stuff. And then the last ones are to the workflow changes within purchasing and order entry. And so what these changes are is previously, if a transaction was a posting transaction, it was game over after that click. The system wouldn't let you change the customer or vendor on the transaction. So you'd have to either delete the transaction or cancel it, reverse it, and create a new one if you accidentally picked the wrong customer or vendor. Or somebody noticed when they were approving, far more likely there, right? And so now there's a new security configuration option, and it's on each transaction definition. It's not on the overall configuration, but within the transaction definition itself that will allow users to change the customer or vendor if it's in a draft or pending state. So there are some caveats. You can only do this if it hasn't been converted. You can only do it if it posts to the general ledger or to accounts receivable and accounts payable, and that transaction date is in an open period. And then you can allow that editing. So you can really hone it down to the transaction definitions you need. All right, and that brings us to our fourth and final polling question. Tracy?
Right. Great. Thanks, Brenda. So we have our fourth polling question here. Is there something in this release that my organization can use immediately? A, true, B, false.
Hopefully you learned something today.
It's looking pretty good. All right, we'll share the results here.
If nothing else, we know y'all want bank feeds, so immediately being relative, since it's not fully rolled out to everybody yet. Last chance to get your CP.
Yep. All right. Looks
Woohoo!
like pretty good outcome there. True at 90%. So as a reminder, we will be sending this webinar out, so feel free to share with your colleagues. I'll throw it to Brenda for conclusion, and then we'll take some Q&A.
Yeah, just for those 10% that said there was nothing that you could use in this release, let us know if there was something in the release notes that you were hoping to see that we didn't cover. Because we're covering the release, obviously, we cover everything in the release each time. Sometimes you're going to have those modules, sometimes you're not. So let us know if there's something else that you were expecting us to deliver today, so we can make this better in the future. So in conclusion, just to cover our learning objectives and our agenda, we covered user experience, general ledger, AP, cash, projects, contracts, inventory, Salesforce, reporting, platform and web services, consolidations, and workflow. A full hour. Hopefully you learned something. and we'd love to hear from you soon.
Yeah, great. Do you think we have time for one question, or we can get to
Yeah,
these?
we've got time for a couple
Perfect.
questions, I think.
All right, so we have some good questions. I'll go to number one here. Is there any functionality that only exists within the Action UI and not the other UI?
Yeah, I can definitely take this one. So there's a few places where you're only going to find this functionality existing in the Action UI and not the other UI. So first off, one of those places is going to be Pay Bills. You're going to find it on the interactive custom report writer, consolidation, some of the stuff Brenda mentioned, your bank reconciliations when the new bank feeds come out, and a lot of things in viewing reports. One thing to note in viewing reports is there's now an option to select kind of the specific density, the reading density that meets your needs. And you can select from compact, moderate, relaxed, just depending on what exactly you need to view. So those are kind of some areas where you're only going to get that functionality being in the Action UI and not the older previous UI.
Awesome. Thanks, David. And I'll go for one more, and then we'll time out here. Is there any new functionality in cash management for customers outside of the US?
Yeah, another one I can definitely take since I talked about cash management. So Intacct now enables Australian customers to make payments to suppliers from any Australian checking accounts using specifically formatted bank files. And so after you've set up these your checking account information for any Australian bank file payments, you're going to want to enable your supplier for bank file payment capabilities. And then finally, when it's time for you to go and make your payment, you'll be able to manually generate this file to upload to your bank for processing. So that's one of the new things for people outside of the US.
Perfect. And I'm just going to wrap it up here quickly. So I just want to thank David and Brenda for all your amazing content and the audience for their questions. Remember to look out for the slides in this recording within 48 hours. Also, if you're looking to get CPE, remember to take that quick survey at the end, and our learning and development team will check for those and get your certificates out. And with that, I'd like to thank you guys all for joining us, and have a great week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.